Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the West Hollywood Planning Commission meeting, Thursday, April 5th, 2018. This is a regular meeting, and I'm calling the matter to order. Richard Giesbrecht, can you lead us in the flag salute? Come on. Ask Jake. Come on, Jake. Thank you. Mr. Secretary, can we have a roll call?
Good evening. Commissioner Hoopengarner?
Present.
Commissioner Carvalero? Here. Commissioner Bass?
Here.
Commissioner Elchel?
Here.
Commissioner Guy?
Here.
Vice Chair Jones?
Here.
Chair Buckner?
Here.
And we have a quorum.
Thank you. The next item is approval of the agenda. Is there any question with regard to the agenda? We have a motion. I could see it on my screen.
Commissioner Bass moved it, seconded by Commissioner Guy. And motion passes unanimous.
Thank you. Next item is approval of minutes. Tonight we have two sets of minutes to approve. Have the commissioners had an opportunity to check over the March 1st, 2018 minutes? And if there's no amendments or changes, or can I have a motion on that March 1st minutes?
Moved by Vice Chair Jones, seconded by Commissioner Elchel.
And Commissioner Guy abstaining, I guess you were absent?
Commissioner Hoopengarner? Thank you.
Sorry, I was absent from the last meeting.
Okay, great. Thank you.
So just to clarify,
Okay.
It was,
and the motion passes.
And the second set of minutes was for the March 15th, 2018 meeting. Do I have a motion on that?
Motion by Commissioner Elchel, seconded by Vice Chair Jones. And
yes, can we just correct the record?
okay, I'll correct I'll correct it in the minutes.
Okay,
yes.
Thank you so much. Sorry about that. Moving on to public comment, item number 6. Do we have any?
We have one. We have Richard Giesbrecht.
Okay, Richard, come forward to the microphone. Thank you.
Richard Giesbrecht, President of West Hollywood West Residents Association. In 2013, West Hollywood West came to an agreement with Cooley's about conditions that would protect the West Hollywood Park. The park is an extremely valuable and important feature of our community. Bottega Louie, Cooley's latest incarnation, doesn't reflect these conditions. What's missing? A 16-foot glass wall, amongst other things. It was intended to acoustically capture noise from the terrace. It's a critical central condition that was eliminated by community development without a director's hearing. The owner simply asked, and it was removed. This sets a precedent for the 30 to 40 other commercial properties on the park. So what happened to process in this situation? Where is the transparency? Where is bureaucratic integrity? Only after the permit was issued was the truth revealed, and then only under some pressure. Is this how community development is supposed to operate? Are you satisfied that you're making decisions up there and they're being executed properly? I truly wonder. I don't like being lied to either. Thank you.
Thank you. Do you have a question?
May we ask the director if he has any comment on this matter?
So, John Kehoe, interim director. So the project did go through a process to do amendments to the project, and the project was revised in several different ways that reduced the scale and size of the outdoor patio on the backside. For instance, the outdoor bar was eliminated. There had been a bar on the outside, and the outdoor bar was eliminated, so that overall reduced the scope and the impact of noise. And so it was approved at an administrative level. We did receive the letter, so we will go back, take a look at the letter, and we'll come back with a response at the next Planning Commission meeting.
Thank you. Thank
Okay,
you.
thank you.
So how many seats, you said it reduced to how many seats outside?
So I don't have that off the top of my head, so that's why we'll come back with a
So there's
response.
still outside dining and all of that?
Yes, there is
Okay.
outside dining, it's just that the size of it was reduced, and the bar that people could stand and gather at was eliminated.
There were 2 bars in the original project, correct? One further on the inside, closer
Correct,
to
one on the
Santa
inside.
Monica, and one was outside,
The one on the rear was eliminated.
was eliminated.
Yes.
And therefore, the wall was altered, eliminated, or taken out entirely?
The glass portion of the wall. There's other objects there, but not the glass portion.
And just briefly, how was this decision made?
So the decision made is through the process of looking at the issue of why was the glass there in the first place. It was for noise issues. And so the application came in with a revision to scale back the patio area. Portion of the patio area was converted to an indoor area, so no more seats. Another portion was for the bar was eliminated, so that was eliminated. There was a sliding glass, or I think it was a garage-style door that opened up the interior to the exterior that rolled up. And so that was changed to fixed glass with doors. So that also reduced the amount of noise that could come from the inside of the building to the outside. So those were all design features that reduced the amount of noise that would be emanating from the site.
So the patio that is there is smaller and is only for dining?
Yes.
And is it open to the park area? Because it was going to be open.
Open meaning, I mean,
Like-
you can see the park from the outdoor area, yes.
But the people from the restaurant couldn't go into the park from that area?
I don't remember off the top of my head if there's a public entrance on that side. We'll have to look at the plans and bring
Okay.
back a report at the
You'll
next
you'll
meeting.
bring it back to,
Right.
can you bring it to the next meeting?
Sure.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And any other questions of the director on this particular item?
Is there time to properly notice it for the next meeting?
No, what I meant was we'll just bring back a staff update on what happened. There's some questions that, I don't have the plans here with me, so I couldn't answer them.
Right, but can that be properly noticed?
Well, it would be under a staff update, so. Right.
Okay.
Okay. Now that you're still there, we're going to have the director's report, if we can, please.
Sure, just one quick item. I wanted to make sure the commission was aware that on the next city council agenda, there is the appeal of a 5-unit condominium project at 1227 Formosa. So that was a project that the Planning Commission approved, and area residents appealed that decision. And so it's going to be on the city council April 16th. So you may want to pay attention to that action.
That was 1227 Formosa, you said?
1227 North Formosa.
Formosa, thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm making a note of that. So, okay, the next is items from commissioners. Do we have any commissioner comments at this time?
Yes, I have one.
Thank you, Lynn.
I noticed from the tentative agenda that I received here tonight that an item that was due to be on the calendar, project spanning residential and commercial, has disappeared from the future. Can we get a staff update as to when that's coming back and when that would be on the agenda?
So thanks for bringing that up. That reminded me, we are actually taking an item to council at the next meeting to get an update from council before we bring it back to Planning Commission.
Thank you.
Thank you. Nothing on the consent calendar, so we'll move on to the public hearings. The first item is 10A, zone text amendment, which deals with affordable housing requirements. Do you have a question? Or you're
Yes.
just waving?
Question.
Okay. Commissioner Altschul, before we go to staff report.
The stated purpose for this amendment was to catch up to the state's laws that have been passed apparently over 5 or so years, perhaps a little more, and so that we are in accordance with those laws. The staff report, at least to my observation, didn't segregate or point out the differences between what is in there to specifically come into alignment with the state laws and what is in there to just enhance or revise or do whatever to the laws that we already have. If it was, I couldn't tell the difference, and I don't know if anybody else could. So in your presentation, could you please make those distinctions as to what aspects of what is supposedly to be acted upon is something that we are, as a city, are trying to hope for our particular code enhancement, as opposed to what is necessary for the state laws, and where it is necessary for the state laws, how it compares to what other cities did to come into compliance.
We'd be happy to.
Okay, we'll have our staff report. Would you, if there's no other questions before we begin?
Thank you, Chair, members of the Commission. My name is Pete Noonan. I'm the Acting Director of Housing, of Human Services and Rent Stabilization, and the city's Housing and Rent Stabilization Manager. I'd like to provide a little overview on our housing program before we jump into the ordinance, realizing that there is a lot of information presented in the packet for the Commission to consider this evening. Being mindful that this evening is for questions, and it's for review and discussion, and that we aren't asking for a formal recommendation tonight, but we will receive your information and come back with the final draft ordinance for your consideration. That being said, I'd like to just start out with a little bit bigger overview of why we have our inclusionary program. These are quick slides, and we won't dwell on them that much, but I ultimately want to focus on, what we're achieving inclusionary affordable housing and why we are doing that, and ultimately our overview of programs. So here in West Hollywood, we really have 4 inclusionary programs. When we think of inclusionary, this is from the context of inclusion, of including people in community. And our programs that do that are certainly rent stabilization. It is affordable units in new construction, which I've highlighted in blue here, because that's really what we consider and talk about and refer to in shorthand lingo as inclusionary housing. And it's what we're going to be looking at this evening. The city also has inclusionary the in lieu fees and a commercial impact fee that we use for partnering with nonprofit housing providers. So when we focus on inclusionary zoning, let's focus on why we have it and what the need in the community is. So who needs housing? Again, there's a lot of it. There's information on the slide. It's basic demographics for the community, that we're 80% renter, that we have higher portions of seniors, LGBT, immigrants from former Soviet republics here. Certainly we have a high % representation of single-person households, but importantly, our housing need. 40% lower income. This includes very low and low, and I'll explain what that means. I've also provided for you our income bands that the council adopts each July. 17% moderate, and then 43% above moderate, which I think is an important percentage that we don't really focus on that much, because we're really focusing on the absolute need of housing in the community, which is really for those affordable households. But we do have a need for housing for people that are earning above affordable. What is affordable? It's when you pay 30% of your income in rent, and that can be achieved in our rent stabilization program. Certainly it can be, but it's not always the case. Affordable housing, on the other hand, this is regulated housing. The rent is based on your income. It comes into 3 brackets: very low, low, and moderate. And these are also used when we talk about affordable units that are in new projects. Those income brackets, as I mentioned, are there on the sheet. I've highlighted the band above the column for households. But then here on the slide, I've presented the income bands for a one-person household to just provide it in context, what we're talking about when we talk about very low or we talk about low, moderate. When we look at this from the need in the community, I use the HUD Comprehensive Housing Affordability Strategy data, which indicates that we have about 10,000 households in the community that earn above affordable housing incomes. That leaves around, I believe it's 13,200 households that would qualify for some level of affordability. So this is, who needs housing? Here's a good distribution showing us who needs affordable housing. So when we look at why we want very low income housing, for instance, it's 60% of people that qualify for affordable housing are earning very low incomes. That's about 5,700 households. Now, this is one of the reasons why often a lot of our programs target these lower income brackets, the very low and the low brackets versus moderate. When we look at our affordable housing dashboard and how we're doing on building housing, here's our regulated housing within the city. You'll see we do have our sizable block is Section 8 units. These are units in market rate housing. It's a voucher program from the county. We do have, if you look on the left-hand side, the bar, that's our affordable nonprofit housing buildings. These are buildings that we've entered into regulatory agreements with, we've given loans to, and we've constructed those housing units in partnership with organizations like the West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation. The second band over, though, is our inclusionary housing program. And really, the value of the program you can see here in the dashed lines. These are the housing achieved in these two programs since the dissolution of redevelopment. So you can see that really inclusionary housing since 2012 has become a real value, very valuable in our program here in West Hollywood. One of the reasons that we've been a little more challenged with providing affordable housing is the market, and the housing market is strong here. It means that we're in direct competition with market rate developers. And so the value of achieving units in market rate developments is that we're having a hard time acquiring that land. Nonprofits are having a hard time acquiring land in West Hollywood to build projects. They're in competition with the market rate developers, and so to us, it's more of a value to receive those units in the market rate buildings while they're being built throughout the city while we still work for that next project. So how did we do in 2017? We received 58 units. It's 4 very low, 30 low, and 24 moderate. You'll see the building right below that on the left-hand side is the Crown. That's one of the newer buildings, and that building it has 8 units in it, 4 very low and 4 low. And then we also have a picture of another building it's older than that, the 901 Hancock building, which also has a series of units along the street there. In the pipeline and upcoming, we have 154 units, 40 very low, 54, and 60 moderate. So we do have a sizable number of moderate units that are coming online through the program. This map is going to be a little hard to see, and I have it on my website. I've put the web address there. I'd encourage you, if you're interested, to look at it, because this map really, it provides the distribution of units throughout the city. And the transparent boxes are projects. These are project sites that have inclusionary units on them. They're not 100% affordable, but they're units that have achieved some level of affordability in that project. The solid boxes are our affordable housing projects. These are the West Hollywood Community Housing Corporation buildings, LA Housing Partnership buildings, the Menorah House building. I kept the slide in there, even though it's a little hard to see, because I wanted you to see the dials on the bottom of the page. The dial on the left is our housing need in the city, and it shows the dark part of that band is the very low income. And you can see that the bulk of the band, as I mentioned, 60% of households need very low income housing. We're able to achieve affordable housing in our 100% affordable housing program.
Can you zoom on that a little bit?
I wish I could. I don't think that I can.
Better on the screen. Yeah, you can see the dial anyway.
Okay, so the importance of these dials is to show you how we achieve housing in the 2 different programs that we have. So within our 100% affordable housing program, which is based on our fees, we're really able to achieve very low income housing and extremely low income housing. This is what but because we take our money and a nonprofit uses that money to leverage other money from state and federal sources, those other sources of funding are really available for these lower income brackets. So how do we achieve low and moderate? That's through our inclusionary program. And you can see on the far right that we do have, that we're actually achieving a different income band within our inclusionary program. 23% of the units in our inclusionary portfolio are moderate rate units. 40% are low income units. Now, our need for moderate housing in the city is 14%, and so we are really achieving a good representation of moderate housing through our program. And as I said, I encourage you to visit the website. If I can, I'll see if I can actually print this out and provide it. I don't think I'll be able to do it this evening, but I'm happy to provide it to you after the meeting. So now to the business of this evening. So the state has been busy redoing its bonus over the last couple of years. And there's several state laws that Jerry Hittleman is going to walk through the commission with. And, but important for the commission to be aware, and the community, that we have a local requirement, and we are required to comply with the state bonuses, but we also can require our local requirement. And so when we talk about the provision of housing, I've noticed that oftentimes that conversation can blend between the two. And so we will, every so often, we may have to clarify one program or the other. For instance, I think it's important to know that our local program does not include a bonus. That's the state program. Our local program is a requirement. I've provided it there on the slide. If a project has 2 to 10 units in it, the requirement is 1 lower income unit, or you can pay a fee. There is an option of paying the in lieu fee for that project. With a project that has 11 plus units, it's 20% affordable, distributed between lower and moderate income units. The state has now allowed us to apply that again to rental apartments that are not asking for a bonus. And so that's one of the amendments in this ordinance. I'll say that again. So we, right now, cannot require on-site inclusionary in an apartment building that does not ask for a bonus. And the challenge there, in 2010, a developer in LA came forward and won a local lawsuit and what the situation was, the courts found that a apartment building that had inclusionary housing in it violated Costa-Hawkins, because essentially affordable housing in and of itself, if you see it this way, is rent control. You control we, the city, control the rents at the onset of the tenancy. And so the courts in that case said that's a violation of Costa-Hawkins. So the Bloom Bill, AB 2505 this last year, clarified in fact that that is not the case for affordable housing, that cities can require rental affordable housing. And so that is essentially one of those changes that we are making. And you have a question,
Has that been tested in the courts yet, the new Bloom?
It hasn't been, no, there's been no contesting in courts yet. Another important aspect of our local requirement to be aware of is that we require permanent affordability. Now, the state's laws say at least 55 years, we're permanently affordable. Okay, so what does the state law really do? Basically, an applicant provides affordable units and they get additional units. That's really the gist of the state's program. These laws that have come into place do require now a 1-for-1 replacement, processing requirements, and as I mentioned, that they do allow us to have rental affordable units. Those are now allowable. Okay, so last slide before the draft ordinance. Again, the new state laws, processing applications, new allowances for transitional foster youth, veterans, I believe seniors, the rental affordable units. And we've also provided, we've included some proposals that really clarify our current practice. And we will do our best as we go through the presentation to point out which ones are in fact a clarification of our local practice versus the requirements of the state. And I can pause at this point if anyone has questions.
When you use the word clarification, in your language, are you making any changes to those current laws, or are you just making them easier to understand?
We will touch on there's two cases in particular in the proposal, one of which is it's a pure clarification of how we distribute units in a project. The other clarification is how in practice we apply the code. And that's for our units, for projects that come in that have 11 to 20 units in them. So if you're willing, when we get to that point in the presentation, I will point out those two.
Okay. Thank you, Peter. Good evening, Chair Buckner and Commissioners. I'll go through what the changes are to our current ordinance and how that has been caused by the new state laws that have come into effect. So here are the new state housing laws. The first one is Assembly Bill 2442, and as you'll see, that allows a density bonus if your project has transitional age youth, or actually transitional foster youth, disabled veterans, and homeless persons. 2501 is procedures and timelines that help you get through the process quicker. 2556 is replacement of demolished affordable units on a one-to-one basis, as you'll see. 1934 allows commercial projects that partner with affordable housing projects to also get some concessions. That's brand new. And then, as Pete pointed out, 1505, under that one, we can now require a certain percentage of units in rental projects to be reserved for affordable units. So again, AB 2442 allows a bonus if your project includes a certain percentage of transitional foster youth, disabled veterans, and homeless persons, and you can see that in this table. The first three bands are the current ordinance. The lower band is the new state requirement under AB 2442. And as you can see, that on the left shows that the unit types would be for those three categories. And if you have a minimum of 10% units that provide units for those category of people, you would get a density bonus of 20% of the same type of units giving rise to the bonus. And you cannot get an additional bonus beyond that as you can for traditional, very low, low, and moderate income, as you can see in the chart.
Jerry?
Yes.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but could you clarify how that would be managed? And would that be managed by the rent stabilization roles? I mean, it's a different class, so how would that be managed?
Right, that would be managed through the housing in the city. And I think it's important to realize that for us, in many ways, this is a procedural change to our code, because the city has a local density bonus for affordable projects that is greater than 20%. We allow up to 100% for our affordable housing projects. And so we don't foresee anyone using this language, but we're required to put it into the code by the state laws. So in other jurisdictions that don't have that bonus for affordability, this is going to be a real great bonus for those companies, those nonprofits that are building this type of housing. But here locally, it's going to be a language change on the code that we'll have for the state requirement.
And how would you distinguish, because presumably some of these people are going to be in very low income in addition to being in these other classes. How does that work?
You know, sometimes the legislature writes interesting language. I don't mean to be funny about that, but I'm not sure that the legislature has completely sorted out how this would really be executed in its entirety. I can tell you, though, that if you are building housing for transitional age youth, transitional foster youth, as it's referred to in the state law, veterans or homeless persons, you are most likely a nonprofit, and you are going after other funding sources. And those other funding sources are going to tie you into covenants and requirements. Here locally, we have our Affordable Housing Trust Fund. And so we would also provide local regulation over those units that would be separate and apart from the zoning code, and that would be through our loan documents and our regulatory agreements.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Now we'll move on to AB 2501, and this bill dictates procedures for local governments to increase timelines, make them faster for density bonus projects, and it proposes doing that, and this will be new to our ordinance, by having the city's local jurisdictions provide a list of documents and information required, notification when applications are deemed complete. Most cities do this already, but they just want to codify it. Require only reasonable documentation, so that's a little hard to interpret sometimes, but we want to keep it to the minimum so they're not giving huge studies and so forth. Density bonus calculation must be rounded up when you have a fractional number, and no additional reports and studies as a condition of an application. All the studies shall be submitted with that application, and redefines housing to include mixed-use housing, which I understand is already being done in the city currently. Also under 2501, the applicant is to provide explanations to facilitate processing. This will help the processing go quicker. The planner gets the project, they'll be able to understand what the concessions are, which are requested, and if it is off the menu, how that unique concession meets the definition of concessions under state law. This could be a narrative. It doesn't have to be a long study and need not be construction financials as well. If a waiver or reduction of development standards is requested, we want to know how they would physically preclude construction of the project as proposed. So it's somewhat like a variance explaining why you were asking for a waiver of a setback, maybe the FAR, or any other concession that is being, or waiver, I'm sorry, that is being asked for. Under state law, you can also do a parking standard reduction, and we want to know how the project would be eligible for that. And I'll go into that in a little more detail later on. So you can, under state law, ask for a greater reduction than what is already in the ordinance today. Also, there's revised procedures under this state law. The review authority would be the same as the underlying application for a land use permit and entitlement, such as Planning Commission or City Council. This is already being done in West Hollywood and most cities. Something that is being done right now but is not in the ordinance is density bonus housing agreements would be processed by the Housing Division after approval. And then also to facilitate projects coming through, after this ordinance is adopted, we'll come out with a nice application and handout that will be put on the website, it'll be available at the counters at City Hall to help developers understand this process and what the new state laws are and how this would help them get projects through quicker. Because just in the overall picture, as you know, the state has a huge deficit in housing, so the state legislature is looking for ways to get these housing projects online quicker, and this will help facilitate that. Also, again, the required calculation for portable units shall be rounded up. So any density calculation, including the base density and bonus density that results in a fractional number, shall be rounded up to the next whole number. Under AB 2556, as Peter pointed out, this talks about replacement units. And it says that replacement units shall have an affordability restriction of at least 55 years as he pointed out, in West Hollywood, this would be a permanent restriction. The replacement with units that remain subject to the local rent control ordinance, so if you replace units, they are still subject to local rent control. And then replacement with units of equivalent size or the same number of bedrooms. So here's an example. Replacement project, whoops, I'm sorry. Let's say you had an existing 10-unit building with 2 units that are rental rate restricted, and you demolish that building and you replace it with a 20-unit residential project. Right off the bat, 20% of the units would have to be affordable. So 20% of 4 is 4 affordable units, and this is under the local ordinance. Now, 2 of the units, replacement units with equivalent number of bedrooms as the affordable units demolished will be required, and the units required to be rent restricted for the equivalent loss of, let's say, very low or low-income families. So that's one example of how that would work. Under Assembly Bill 1934, this one's interesting. I've never seen a project come through with this, and we might in the future, I'm not sure. Concessions would be given for commercial projects that partner with an affordable housing project. Now, it could be a mixed-use project on the same building, or it could be a commercial project standing alone and contributing money to a project that is off-site, an affordable housing project. So going back to the intent for the state legislature, they want to see if commercial development can inject some money into affordable housing. So the commercial project would get some concessions or waivers. There would be a 20% increase in the allowable general plan intensity. They'll be allowed to increase their floor area ratio or height limit by 20%. 20% also in parking reduction in parking. A limited use elevator for upstairs, upper floor accessibility, and other exceptions to the zoning ordinance. So we haven't seen any examples of this, but this is in the state law.
So, I'm sorry, Jerry,
Yes.
just to be clear, so if this developer came in and said, I don't want the affordable in my building, I'm going to give my money to this affordable housing developer across town.
Correct.
I still get my bonus, my height bonus, but does the affordable building also get the height bonus, or is it one or the other?
That's a good question. It depends if the affordable offsite project also would qualify under the ordinance for the concession. So they would have to qualify on their own, but the commercial developer would. And that's how I understand it. Is that correct, Peter? So
do we have any language, I didn't see it in the ZTA, that would clarify that that bonus only gets awarded once? Yeah. I may have, there's a lot here, so I may have missed it.
And this is a good point of clarity that we're jotting down notes on and looking into, because again, this is part of the new state requirements, and it's not something that's been fully implemented anywhere else in the state. So we're really, yes.
What impact, if any, does this have on our legislation that says anything over 10 units, the affordable has to be on site?
Well, and that's another part of this that we need to sort out, because ultimately I think that you're accurately pointing out a little detail of this that is in conflict with our local requirement, which is if you provide more than 10 units, you're required to provide 20% on site. What do we do in that case when they are giving money to an affordable housing provider to satisfy their requirement and building it off-site? That's another point that we will come back to you with answers for.
Also,
So
just
I
one
think
more point.
Isn't the answer to that logically which will provide the most affordable units?
We'll take that into consideration and see if that's possible.
So
Another
related,
possible scenario is that it's a 100% commercial building, and so under today's ordinances, if it's over 10,000 square feet, they have to pay an in lieu affordable fee, so they have to pay a fee already. And then if they ask for this for the density bonus, then they'd pay, I guess, an additional fee that goes to the other offsite developers. So they, in essence, pay twice.
And you said that the bonus is either height limit or an increase to the FAR. Is it or either or both?
Under state law, it could be both, but
Or all three, right?
yeah, or all three. It doesn't really make a distinction.
The state law includes some odd language that we haven't seen before that says, if they meet those requirements, they could be eligible for one of the following that is mutually agreed upon by the applicant and the review authority. That language is word for word from the statute, and that's not a term that we see in the other density bonus ordinance, or density bonus statute, which we've talked about many times. So there's clearly going to be some issues with how to implement this. We haven't seen one yet. We're putting the language in as the state law requires, and this feedback is very helpful as we, craft the language the best we can to respond.
So is our language exactly the same language as the state, or are we changing it some? Because according to this little shortcut that we're looking at, it's not consistent with what you just said, Laura.
I'm reading the language in the staff report on page 10 of 22, which is the language that will go in the code. And actually, it's probably even better to read straight from the ordinance. It should be word for word, but let's do that.
Yeah, and we'll double check that it's exactly the same as state law.
The mutually agreed upon language is absolutely from state law, because I would never write it that way.
Like reasonable, what's reasonable?
So, related to this, in the state law and in our code here, I'm not seeing a definition of affordable housing developer. And I'm wondering if that wouldn't be an important thing to include, even though it's not in the state law, that we are clear as to who qualifies to be an affordable housing developer. What is the definition of someone that we would want to be able to do this? I mean, I could form my own 501c3 tomorrow and become an affordable housing developer, but I don't think I really should. So.
That's a good point. We do have definitions in the back, as you saw, but that wasn't there, right? So we'll look into adding that.
Because the statute really focuses on the relationship between the two and the agreement between the two, less on who they are, but what they're doing.
But I think it's important we know who they are.
We can look at that.
Commissioner Altschul?
Some of these laws, according to the staff report, go back 5 or so years.
I don't think it's that.
How come we're not just now coming to the table with bringing them into compliance?
So the one-for-one replacement requirement that was amended by AB, Jerry, help me with it's
2556.
2556. That was originated by AB 2222, which in fact does go back to 2016. We have been following that law since it was put in place. And so even though it hasn't been on the books, we have been requiring the one-for-one replacement requirements that have been in the code since that time.
Is there a time limit under which we have to bring these things into conformity with what the state says?
Not listed in the state law, no, but as Peter mentioned, we would process applications in compliance with the state law because that's what controls for some of these things.
And this state law came into effect, all of these, like different times?
Yes, I think there's 4 or 5 bills listed in the staff report. Some of them went into effect were adopted in 2015, which means they went into effect at the beginning of 2016. Then there was another crop of bills that went into effect during 2016, which means they went into effect January 1st, 2017. And that's the time period that this ordinance is covering.
So our planning department has been approving projects consistent with state law, even though we haven't codified it for ourselves, for our city. Is that correct?
Yes, and an example of that is we've gotten questions, people refer to AB 2222, and I'm not going to use bill numbers because that's confusing to people, but the replacement requirement, if you take rent-stabilized units off the market and you replace them, you have to, well, we'll talk about that in a minute. He hasn't gotten to that part yet, but that's one of the ones that, staff has been doing that even though it wasn't in our code yet.
I thought I saw that one of these laws goes back to 2013. Is that correct?
Yeah, but 2222 is not in here.
Pardon? No. Not right?
I do have to say, if there's any concern on that, some of the value in having held off on updating our local code is that the state legislature made some fairly significant changes to the one-for-one replacement since they adopted it in with 2222, and so in some ways it's fortunate that we didn't make changes right away to our local code, but that we applied and we followed the state laws.
We gave them a chance
Yeah.
to wake up.
That's
Yeah.
what I saw. There's a reference in the staff report that the last time our code received a comprehensive amendment was 2014. Maybe that's the 2014 reference that was noted.
Yeah, because most of these were adopted by the state in 2016, as pointed out. Okay. You ready to move on?
Yeah. I'm wondering if it might be easier to discuss each one as we go along rather than the whole thing. I'm starting to get confused again.
Well, we also want to have public comment, so maybe staff could finish the presentation, we hear public comment, and then you could deliberate by each topic or each bill.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
Okay.
Sorry for interrupting.
thank you. Now we move on to AB 1505, and as Peter pointed out, this bill allows new rental residential projects not requesting a density bonus to actually first I'll point out under current regulations they can pay the in lieu fee or a provision of affordable units for
It's over
rental
10?
units.
Under 10 or fewer.
And then under the revised affordable housing ordinance, 10 or fewer rental units may pay an in lieu fee or provide affordable units, but 11 or more rental units, 20% must be affordable. So that gets to the lawsuit that we were talking about earlier. And now we can actually require those units to be built for 11 or more new units. Yeah.
Just for the commission, on page 11 of your staff report,
What jurisdiction was that lawsuit?
this is the Palmer decision
Palmer.
that
Los
brought
Angeles.
this forward. Yeah, City of Los Angeles.
Palmer, 6th Street?
6th Street, yeah, Jeff Palmer. If you on page 11 of your staff report, if you remember back to 2014 and that amendment that we came forward with, we introduced a chart into the code to address the Palmer issue. And now we're able to take the chart out. And so this slide and what Jerry was just explaining, in fact, in essence and in functionality in the code, we're able to remove that chart now and just simply say, if you're building 11 units or more, you're required to provide 20% affordability.
And is that inclusionary on-site? All on-site?
On-site, yes, correct. Yeah. Palmer made it so that we could not require on-site inclusionary if you weren't asking for a bonus or something beyond your zoning code allowances. That's no longer the case anymore.
And I just want to add one other point. After this bill was adopted, staff took an item to the city council a month or two ago asking for direction. Do you want us to go back to the way it was before, or do you want to keep it the way it was? And so city council gave direction on this piece to go back to the way it was before the Palmer decision. That was a month or two ago. Yeah.
Okay. Now we move on to additional affordable housing regulation revisions, and this cleans up or brings clarity to some of the practices that have been going on. So we're looking for equivalency of affordable unit size. So projects of 11 to 20 units, again, 20% of the unit count shall be affordable units of comparable size and finish quality to the non-inclusionary units. And you see, in the current ordinance, we have a 650 square foot minimum for those units. So the developers tend to go towards the minimum. So we took that out. They also should meet the same equivalency for finishes and appliances and the quality of units. So the affordable shall be equivalent size and quality as the other units in the building. This also, by doing this, affordable units are required to represent an equitable distribution of units in the project in terms of size and bedroom count. And that's actually in the state law. And the reason this is being struck from the current ordinance is because this will help the city and the projects that come forward to meet family size, maybe caregiver needs. Sometimes if you have all studio or one-bedroom units for lower income families, they might have 2 or 3 kids and need a larger unit. So we're looking for some equivalency in that. Now, also, this might help projects in the reverse, because some projects might come forward with all studios and one-bedrooms that are 500 square feet. By striking this language, the affordable units can also be 500, let's say, square feet. So it helps out in that case as well.
We have, under certain circumstances, just overruled ourselves with respect to that and allowed certain projects to have the clustering of the affordables and to have, what's the other element of it? The quality of the finishes diverse. Can we still do that or not?
Yes, that's still possible, and I think you're speaking to those projects that provide an additional public benefit in exchange for
we're
the
not
clustering.
conforming to state law, we're revising our own position.
Correct.
This is one of these circumstances.
Yes, sir, and this is one of those changes, Commissioner, that is a local. This is part of our local, and what we're doing here is really clarifying.
Yeah, I think that should be pointed out on every case where this is the situation, yes, where we're revising our local to conform to what is our political reality.
Yes, and this is one of those changes that we are proposing. The reality here is, as Jerry said, but also functionally, locally, we have a requirement. Our requirement for equity within the building is what we typically apply to the units. And so when you have a project coming forward, we also have requirements within our code that the units are equitable in terms of size, distribution, and finish qualities. And on this project size, that's typically what we have seen, how we have applied the unit distribution within the buildings. And so having the language here in our local requirement allowing or speaking to this fact of the 650 unit size has been a little point of confusion in the application within the projects.
Was it or was it not the case, my memory doesn't work so good, that the Millennium Project, which is coming up for discussion next meeting, was the first instance in where the clustering was allowed?
Now, that project didn't, in fact, result in clustering. I think that there was a discussion of it at some point along the way, but that actually has a distribution of units throughout. There are a couple other projects, though, that have had clustering. There's, of course, the Palm Project, which is still yet to be built along Santa Monica Boulevard at Palm. There is the 902 Doheny project, which is under construction now. That project is clustered. However, there is a public benefit in that clustering in that they are gifting those units to a nonprofit housing provider. That project, they're also providing.
What address on Doheny?
702 Doheny, 2 blocks north of Santa Monica.
Pumpkin Patch.
Yes, the pumpkin patch.
I'd like to concur with Commissioner Altschul that when this comes back to us, whether via color or some vehicle, clarify for us which things are being amended in order to comply with state law and which things are discretionary for us as a city to decide, because I think that informs us much better in terms of how we can make decisions and what, you know, because otherwise we'll be debating a thing we can't even debate because it's a compliance issue, whereas there's other things that are truly discretionary. And I think that would be very helpful for me.
And just briefly, where are our neighbors in doing this process? Beverly Hills, Culver City, Los Angeles?
So Los Angeles, I believe 2 years ago, the voters of Los Angeles voted in inclusionary housing. And Beverly Hills does have a couple of inclusionary units that were produced through the state requirements. They have no local requirement. Culver City, I'm not entirely certain if they have a local requirement or not, but certainly Santa Monica has a local requirement and has built a substantial number of units through their inclusionary requirements. Pasadena as well, and a couple other cities around us are looking at similar ordinances like this. But really the three strongest programs here in our local area are West Hollywood, Pasadena, and Santa Monica.
Okay.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question, a point of clarification, please? I'm looking at page 16 of 22. So, and I want to make sure that I understand how we define things, and how the state defines things, and what's required versus what's discretionary. So, under item 2, under affordable unit size equivalency, the paragraph underneath item 2. So, in reference to the part that we're striking, the minimum interior, or that we're proposing to strike, the minimum interior area of 650 square feet, so you're proposing that we remove that minimum, but then we're not striking this part about finishes and appliances of builder's quality or better. But then in this next paragraph, it says, under state law, affordable units are required to be of comparable size and finish quality as non-inclusionary units. How are we defining finish quality?
Well, that in
Are we talking
fact-
about like the same appliance packages? Like if I'll use a round number, like we'll say 14 of the units in the building have sub-zero refrigerators and, Wolf ranges, like something very high end. Would the inclusionary units also have that?
Yes.
And is that standard? I mean, have we been doing that? I'm only asking, and I want to note that this is a nuance of like having these kinds of conversations, because we're talking about two different kinds of housing stock here. So inclusionary units and the units that are actually in the building. But thinking about equity across the affordable housing stock, is that how we've been applying this?
Tell me more about equity across the affordable housing stock. That would help me answer.
For background, so you and I had kind of an email exchange about like the way that housing, we define equity in the city. And I'm just thinking about like, if I'm a person who has a low-income unit in one building, and I have XYZ number of square feet and certain appliance package, whatever the case might be, and then someone else who also has a low-income inclusionary unit has something that's completely different. I'm just wondering how we're defining equity. So it sounds to me like it's equity within the building, not equity across the affordable housing stock. That's my question. And it's not meant to set it up as like a have and have not situation. I just want to understand from the point of fairness of people who are in the units, like actually in the inclusionary units, like what does equity look like for them? Is it the people who live in their building or the other people who are in units like them across the city? This is a kind of a big like social issue, but that's like, I feel like it warrants asking.
It's a good question. I think it's an important question, and it's important to realize and be aware that the inclusionary program achieves subtly different goals than the 100% affordable housing program. inclusionary programs typically can be ownership programs. They can be targeted at a higher income ratio, which ours is. So we have moderate households, low-income households in our inclusionary program. We do also have very low-income households and units that have been achieved through our inclusionary, and it's thankful that we've had those units achieved through the program because we've been struggling to produce other 100% affordable housing projects. But in your traditional, typical inclusionary program, it is mainly targeted at ownership, targeted at moderate and low-income housing. Now, is it equity throughout from building to building across the portfolio? No, it's equity within the building. And the equity, when I talk about equity within the units, it's creating a sense of place and dignity for someone living in the unit in that building. We don't want the affordable units in any way, shape, or form to look different, to appear different, to be segregated into a different area of the building, to be all on one floor, to be all in one corner, or to have all of one look, because anyone living in that unit should feel that they are at equal level to anyone else living in the building.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I can also add that I've worked on a number of affordable projects in other cities, and this is something that other cities try to achieve as well in terms of their affordable projects per building. So I've seen that equity occur consistently.
Can I ask a question about clustering? Kind of a couple of comments back. In those situations where we've allowed units to cluster, do they have separate entrances, or do they all share the same entrance as the other units?
We don't have any buildings in the city that have separate entrances.
Okay.
I'm twisting my face around because I'm thinking of the Beverly project, the mixed-use project on Beverly, and did that ever get fixed then?
Yeah, they do not have a separate
Inconsistent.
They do not have a separate entrance.
Not anymore, right?
No.
Correct.
But it is clustered in one side of the building.
Correct. That is one of the buildings that is clustered, and they did provide an additional public benefit for that clustering. So the code does allow for clustering with the provision of an additional public benefit.
What benefit did they?
Yeah, what benefit did they provide?
I believe that project provided additional affordable housing funding.
Do you know, in the approximate amount?
On site or
Yeah,
elsewhere?
I believe that it was. I believe that it was $1.5 million.
$1.5 million
In affordable housing funding, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Looking at all these changes just makes you think about other projects that have come before us at different times over the years.
Commissioners, I just wanted to point out that all the slides from this point forward and the slide before this that say additional affordable housing regulation, these are all regulations that do not relate back to the current state law for the most part.
These are all just our internal.
These are our cleanup items or clarifications.
Not from now forward.
Yes, and the previous slide as well. So just, and we'll point that out in the next staff report, but just keep it in mind for tonight.
So basically, very little of this whole proposed idea relates to the state thing, but that's the basis for updating or modernizing or reconfiguring for whatever purposes our affordable housing rules.
No, there were several sections that we went over that take up large amounts of the strike-through and additional edits. Were all, I mean, volume-wise, there's a lot of language that we're changing because of the state.
Yeah, these tend to be smaller cleanup items, and they actually clarify current practice in some cases, as you'll see. So it's not the bigger ones like John pointed out. So let me see. I don't think I've talked about this. Relocation fee requirements. So again, before approval of a final map, the applicant shall post the relocation fees for each inclusionary unit in an escrow account approved by the director and the finance director. So I think this, again, is a cleanup of a current item. The rent stabilization ordinance includes one set of relocation fees for rental and condominium projects, and will be applying to all tenant displacement under the revised ordinance. The level of affordability requirements. This is a clarification in our ordinance. One affordable unit can be assigned to very low or low designation. Now, if you have 2 or more affordable units, go through a pattern of the first unit is very low or low, second would be moderate, third would be very low or low, and continue the same pattern, so we have an equitable distribution of lower income units and the moderate. As you saw in the chart in the beginning of the presentation, that's how we get an equitable distribution.
But whether it's very low or low, the appliances or whatever the features are of the building will be consistent.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Can I ask legal, how does the state law speak to this? Because I didn't see this. It doesn't speak to this at all?
I think that's what we're being told, is that going forward from now, these are things that are just changing or clarifying our own municipal code. Is that correct?
Right, but does it in any way conflict with state law?
This doesn't conflict with state law, but I do want to point out, because I think that you may be raising, or you may feel that there might be a conflict. We will, when we return, add one piece of flexibility. And the reason for that is when we have a one-for-one replacement at the state level, we would have to, I believe we would have to consider that in our local level. So for instance, if someone had a unit requirement replacement locally, let's just say of 4 units, our requirement would be 2 very low or low, 2 moderate. However, they've applied for a bonus. And with the bonus and the new laws that require the one-for-one replacement, if their one-for-one replacement for the state bonus is 4 low-income units, I believe that we would count those as meeting the local requirement. So in fact, we would, in that case, our local requirement would net 4 low-income units. We wouldn't get the 2 moderate in that case. But we will work that out. We will provide that little bit of language flexibility if, in fact, we need it. So I think that may have addressed what you were finding.
I think so, thank you.
So we're going to see this again, is what you're telling us, and that you're just wanting some input from the commission as we move on each of these items.
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
In some of these situations where projects are under discussion, sometimes we hear the word bonus, and sometimes we hear the word concession. Is there a difference between those 2 concepts or not?
There is.
Yeah. So in the density bonus law, the bonus is the extra square footage, the bigger building that they get in exchange for providing affordable units. The concessions are, in addition to a bigger building, they can ask for a couple deviations from our code standards in order to recover the cost of having provided affordable units. So they can deviate from the development standards in a way that might save them some costs. And
that does relate to state law, correct?
Yes, the bonus comes from state law, the concessions come from state law. There's another type of deviation, which is called a waiver or modification in state law, and that's if, with all these things, you're still violating some code standard and you can't physically build this building, state law allows for a waiver of that standard, whatever it may be, a setback or some kind of requirement.
Parking standard?
Something like that. The test is if it physically precludes construction of your project with your bonus and your concessions, you can ask for a waiver on top of all your concessions. So that whole package of ideas comes from state law.
Now, this slide talks about clarification of current administrative practices. So the in lieu fee to be paid prior to the issuance of building permits, the projects that include inclusionary units, bonus units, concessions, or waivers shall record the city's agreement imposing restrictions on real property. So that means they have to record it as an agreement or a deed restriction. This slide talks about new inclusionary affordable units shall be occupied in the following manner. So if a building is demolished and you have units that are demolished where existing tenants earn very low or moderate incomes, the tenant shall be given the right of first offer to occupy the new affordable replacement units. So the existing tenants are gone, they would be first in line to get the new units. Now, if there are no qualified tenants or the tenants choose not to stay in the same area or building, then we would go to the waiting list. The city does have a inclusionary housing waiting list. So this is a procedural requirement, and it clarifies how this should be done, and it's not in the current ordinance right now.
Is it still then the contemplated policy that people who have been Ellis go to the top of that list?
Yes, that's correct. And I should say we will also clarify when we return, because this language and this approach is in the code now, or it's in our practice. And so we will clarify and specify what parts are in fact not in the code, what is in the code. And essentially, we want to just bring it all in, put it into one section. So if you notice, this is under 19.22090, I believe, which is a section that is the rental or sale of units. In the past, we've had specifics that related to the rental or the sale of the units kind of dotted throughout 19.22. And in 2014, we brought some of that language from other sections into 090. And this also brings other parts into 090, and then also codifies some of the requirements that we have within our program that are outside of the zoning code.
So one of my questions is about previously Ellis tenants from other buildings. I believe, didn't council ask that that those be number 2 in the queue? That Ellis people from this property would be first in the queue, and second in the queue would be other Ellis tenants?
So in 2007, the council, that was the last time they reflected on our priorities within the inclusionary housing program, and that's through a resolution at the council level that does give priority to displaced households within the city. And so how we would apply that here is exactly how you've pointed out. Number one, for these projects, a project coming online, we would offer that to any households that are displaced from the project. If that is not the case, then we do move to our displaced households on the list. And then the next priority that we have is for people that live within West Hollywood, people that work within West Hollywood, and then we have another series of priorities after that.
So should the zone text reflect that?
I'm not certain that the zone text would need to, but we'll make note of that and bring that forward if necessary. Like I said, that is actually within a resolution from the council establishing those priorities.
Another clarification of current administrative practices is eligibility requirements in rental and a rental and sales price schedule for the very low, and moderate income households shall be established annually by council resolution. And I believe this is being done now, but we're just cleaning up the language in the ordinance. So
this is just I believe that this is a language, it's being moved from one section of the code to another, and we will clarify that when we return.
Yes. Some further clarifications on security deposits. A security deposit equal to or greater of 1 month's rent or $500 shall be required, and same thing with the pet deposit, just codifying that it cannot exceed 25% of the security deposit.
Is that per pet?
I don't know if that was a pet or not.
What?
No, that is the whole pet deposit.
Yeah, 4 dogs, it's just 25%.
Now, you can typically have under, with the reasonable accommodation, 2 pets. So I think that it may, in fact, be, it may default to 2 pets. These 2 points are what we have in our rental lease itself. And so we had other aspects that were in the code, so we're bringing these into the code as well.
The next one, density bonus, is allowed for a mixed-use commercial residential development, including a child care facility that will be located on premises or a land donation for a child care facility. And this is not in the current code. It actually is allowed under state law, so it is not in the current amendments to state law, but it is in state law, so it is consistent. I don't know if you've seen.
This is new for us, though.
Right, this will be new for West Hollywood, and I don't know if you've had projects that have come forward that have taken advantage of this, but it will be codified now.
Does the land have to be in the city?
I believe so. But
So you have to donate land in the.
Yeah. We'll come back with a clarification on that as well, but that would be part of the agreement.
So, Jerry,
Yes.
just as a point of reference, when I was reading through this, especially in light of the thing that's coming before council about the projects that span residential and commercial properties, it would be helpful if throughout this, in the language, and maybe even in our definitions, we're very clear about a mixed commercial residential development as opposed to one that spans 2 different pieces of differently zoned properties.
Okay, yeah. Well,
because it could, it's easy to kind of confuse the two because they are very different things.
correct. We'll definitely clarify that because you could have vertical or horizontal, and I think that's the point you're trying to make. So, okay, good.
Thank you.
Thank you. There's also an exemption for accessory dwelling units and junior accessory dwelling units that we brought this before you a few months ago, and that's been codified by the council now. We talked about revised parking regulations per state law. They are now, this actually is an older state law that has never been codified in the West Hollywood ordinance. So parking may be provided in tandem configuration and may be uncovered. Projects with a maximum percentage of affordable units may provide a parking ratio not to exceed 0.5 spaces per bedroom. So that's a little bit lower than what is currently in the ordinance, and this is totally in line with state law as well.
In other words, if you have a 1-bedroom, you can build half a parking space?
Well, I think we'd have to check if that would be rounded up or down. That's a good question. But yeah, not half unless you had a smart car or something. So.
If you have 2 smart cars, you can park them in tandem.
But typically, you'll have a number of units in a building, so it adds up if you have 0.5 for 10.
I know.
But that's a good question.
Can you explain the thinking about the uncovered parking?
Just to
Parking lot.
make parking a little bit easier. We saw the same thing with the accessory dwelling units, so that you don't have to have them in a structure. They could be lined up tandem in a driveway. It probably doesn't work as well for multifamily, although sometimes you do see tandem in the underground parking, so one family can park tandem. The uncovered, probably wouldn't see too much in West Hollywood because of the density here. So you might see that in other areas, but this is consistent with state law.
So state law discusses the uncovered parking?
Yes, and we'll double check that and come back with the section of state law that codifies
Because I
it.
think it would be important to distinguish between a duplex setup versus a big mixed-use multifamily project.
Right.
Because all of a sudden having exposed outdoor parking becomes perhaps not something visually we would care to include in this city. So keeping it that generic might not be the ideal way to go. That might be to be more specific.
Yeah, that's a
Good
helpful
point.
comment. One thing I'll point out, the state law applies to housing projects of 5 units or more. So if it's something that we need to clarify in the code, that's a good comment.
Yeah.
Thank you. Again, a clarification on off-site construction of affordable units allows inclusionary units to be provided at an approved off-site location. And this revision specifies that a minimum of 2 units shall be provided at an off-site location. So not 1 unit. And again, just a clarification.
So if you are building 9 units and you have the requirement to have 1 affordable unit, if you want it off-site, you have to pay for 2?
Right, so you're not just building one, you'd have to do a duplex off-site, as, for instance, or greater. So duplex or greater.
So, again, that's not state law, that's city code? The 2 units
2
off-site.
units off-site. Can't recall offhand, you know.
We'll check on this.
Okay.
We'll clarify these last 2 slides.
I guess one of the reasons I ask is, when we get to implementation and talking about reality here, if I'm a developer and I have a choice of an in lieu fee, 1 inclusionary on-site, or 2 affordable off-site, that's just not ever going to happen. Because why would I pay twice as much as I need to?
Right.
So I wonder why we would even include this in our code if it's just not even practical. I don't see how. Can you give me a scenario where
That's
that
something
might
we
happen?
would want.
If we could, I think staff would prefer to return with more information on this slide and the prior slide.
These are local requirements. These are in your inclusionary ordinance.
Yeah.
These 2.
Then we move to rental and sale of affordable units. Then the eligibility requirements and a rental and sales price schedule for the very low, low, and moderate income households shall be established again annually by council resolution. So that's, again, I think Peter touched on that earlier in the presentation. He also pointed out that affordable units in West Hollywood shall be permanently reserved and occupied by qualified households. The state law reads 55 years or at least 55 years.
But, so why are we doing that?
So we can qualify.
Huh?
So you and I can qualify.
So we can qualify when we get really old?
Yeah.
Like we're not there yet?
Was that answered?
Yeah.
Okay.
I guess.
Okay, and then I pointed out that we are adding some definitions, and we know about the other definition to add. Clustering, density bonus, what density bonus housing agreements are, density bonus units, inclusionary housing, what a major transit stop is, that has to do with parking requirements, and special needs housing also is defined. So I won't go into detail, but if you have any to add to that, we definitely want to hear about that or to subtract.
I would just say that on the inclusionary housing as a definition, it's speaking to the regulation, but it's still a noun, it's a thing. It's the inclusionary housing, so I don't know how that might be clarified, but if it's 2 separate definitions, inclusionary housing regulation versus actual inclusionary housing as a definition of a thing.
We can look at that distinction. That's a Good idea. Okay, so again, this evening, we were asking you to provide comments and questions, which you have. They're excellent. And request additional information. And staff, again, will return with additional information and the final draft ordinance. And we'll ask you to make a recommendation to the city council at that point. So we're open for questions or public input.
How long do you think that would take before it came back here, approximately?
I'm not sure. I think John's looking at the schedule.
We know it's not going to come back at the next agenda. May 3rd already has 3 project items and a general plan item, so probably May 3rd or May 17th, maybe.
Does that take into account the work that Peter and Jerry need to do?
And it kind of depends on that. That's why I said it's maybe May.
But say, you think before the middle of the summer?
Oh, yes. We'd want to get it done by no later than June because we want to get it going.
Lauren, since the commissioners contributed quite a bit while the project was being presented by our staff as part of the staff report, would it be appropriate this time to allow public comment and then discuss it further?
Maybe a break before discussion.
Yeah,
I have a question. So taking a step back to the parking incentives, I just want to make sure I understand. So there's a car, because I know the city of LA now has a program that's similar to this, but so there's a carve out if the residential or mixed residential commercial development includes the maximum percentage of low or very low and so on and so forth. Is the maximum percentage, i.e. the entire project? Or is it the max? Like, I know this might be a stupid question, but I'm not clear on.
Yes, it would be the entire project, and I would say that most, if not all, projects would qualify for this because they are going to the maximum under the, because they are required to provide the inclusionary units.
No, what I mean is, the maximum percentage of low, very low income and so on and so forth, that would be 100%, would that not? Like, sorry, maybe I'm reading it very broadly. I'm sorry, I'm on page 17 of 22.
Right.
Because in theory, the maximum number is 100%, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So this would only be applicable then if the entire project was affordable? Is that correct? Or am I reading this incorrectly?
I think the maximum under the chart on page, let me see what page the chart's on.
Page 3?
Page 3, correct. But we'll clarify that as well.
Because we have the minimum, but we don't have the maximum on that chart, so I just was...
That's a good point. We'll have to see if the minimum is the maximum also, so.
Yeah.
That's,
This language
that
is
should be
from
clear.
state law, so it says,
Yeah.
it's clarified, clarified's not the right word, it's simplified a little bit in the ordinance because the state law keeps referring back to other sections of the state law, and it's very difficult to follow, but it says, if a development includes the maximum percentage of low-income or very low-income units provided for in paragraphs 1 and 2 of F, and F is your density bonus, so it's the maximum bonus, then you can, and you meet all these other requirements, then that reduced parking ratio applies.
So I'm sorry, could you...
Then you would reduce the parking? Is that what you said?
Yes.
sorry, could you clarify? So the maximum of the bonus?
Yeah, max bonus.
Okay. And then they get a parking...
You can't get it if you're just providing, a little bit. It's if you're maxing out and doing, as much as you can, then you get this lower.
Then you get a parking reduction to
Then you
0.5 spaces per unit. No, not to exceed 0.5 spaces per unit.
Yes, and there's already, density bonus projects already have a different parking standard. So this is even below that if you're maxing out. It's, just for example's sake, the regular density bonus parking is for 0 1 bedroom, it's 1 space, and then this is half a space. So you see if you're maxing out a project with as much affordable and bonus as you can get, then you get an even more
It's half a space per bedroom.
Yes.
Got it.
Okay, thank you, everyone. We'll have an opportunity to comment further. I believe we do have one public speaker, is that correct?
Yes, Edward Levin.
Mr. Levin, come forward, please. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you. I'd actually like to ask the indulgence of the chair if I could have a little extra time, because I can help clarify some of the timing and the enactment dates of some of these things, but if I have 2 minutes, I'm going to skip over all that.
Oh, you can have at least 3 minutes, but
Excellent.
Is that going to be enough?
Let's see.
Okay,
Edward Levin, resident of West Hollywood. I think so. I will try to talk fast. All of these assembly bills were...
Mr. Levin, just before we start the clock, can you please state your name and city of residence?
I thought I did, but
Oh,
Edward Levin, resident, City West
Oh,
Hollywood.
fast, okay, good.
All of these were enacted as of 1 January 2017. One of them, which is 2556, is a correction of Nazarian's own bill 2222, which was enacted 1 January 2016 because 2222 was such a mess. Quite frankly, 1934 is also a mess, and that is probably also going to get amended when people try to use it and find out, as with 2222, that it doesn't work. 2442, staff's exactly right. It's useless in West Hollywood, so we adopt it as state law and move forward. 1505 is the Palmer fix. We're going back to status quo ante. That's also perfect. 2501, which is the Bloom bill, is where we have the issues. I addressed this in the memo I sent. The principal concerns have to do with reasonable documentation. The purpose of reasonable documentation was to establish eligibility. Now, our city attorney has been very creative and is trying to use establishment of eligibility by establishing that you meet the definition of a concession. What we cannot do is have one standard for on-menu concessions and another for off-menu concessions. We can expedite a process for on-menu. We can't have different standards for them. That simply isn't going to pass muster. So if we're requiring an explanation, the question is this: could you turn down that concession if you believe that the explanation is not adequate? And if your answer to that question is yes, then you shouldn't ask for the explanation, because that shifted the burden of proof to the applicant, and the burden of proof is on the city to determine that it's not necessary using substantial evidence. So that's my concern with that, which is it is de facto going to be used, it can be used, to turn down a concession improperly by shifting the burden to the applicant to prove that it's necessary. And if you're not going to do that, there's no point in asking for how this meets the definition. Also, with parking, I have to take issue with Mr. Hiddleman. The parking issue of the explanation for that refers back to 1922-050F, which is our own parking reduction. And what the state law says about that is that the city shall grant or shall not require more parking than that upon request of the developer. That's the exact quote. You can't ask for an explanation if it's simply ministerial upon request of the developer. But as I said, the biggest issue is the concession. The waiver, you can absolutely require an explanation of the waiver. You can require that an applicant prove that they can't fit the allowable square footage or the allowable units within the zoning envelope. That's the only point at which they're entitled to a waiver. That one's perfectly fine as you have it written, as is the establishment for the bonus. But what I really want to talk about is the elimination of the 650 square foot one-bedroom allowance. That is not a cleanup. It's not a clarification. This is a policy change. Back in 2007...
Excuse me, Mr. Levin. You've exceeded your time, but let's give you another minute, okay?
Thank you. Basically, we originally said anything under 20 units you can pay an in lieu fee. In 2007, we changed that. We said we're going to require on-site from 11 to 20 units. But because of the impact of smaller buildings, of those affordable units, we said we will therefore allow those buildings, only the 11 to 20 unit buildings, to provide 650 square foot one bedrooms with builder's quality. It reduces the bulk of those buildings because you're talking about a 650 square foot unit as opposed to a 1,200 or a 1,500 equivalent. And quite frankly, the idea that dignity means that you have to have the same appliance package is very strange to me. I don't know what my neighbors have for their appliances. Our doors look the same. I'm in Unit D, A, B, C, and E. The door looks the same. I don't know what goes on inside those units. I don't know what their what their appliances are. So the idea that that somehow is an equity issue is very odd to me. We created this carve-out for 651 bedroom units specifically for these mid-sized buildings, the two-lot buildings. It still makes sense. This is a policy that we should not change, and that's what it is. This is a policy change. This is not a clarification. It's not state law. It's not cleanup. Thank you.
Thank you. Does anybody have questions? Mr. Levin, do you want to stay up here? People may have questions for you.
Mr. Levin, Jerry, and Peter. Mr. Levin, I think, has put all of his thoughts into a rather comprehensive letter, which I guess you have. So if you will, please take that into consideration when you're doing your revision of this.
Take a good look at some of the issues that he's raised.
We can do that.
Thank you. Yes, I always distribute that to staff whenever I send anything to you.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any questions? No?
No,
okay,
no,
thank you.
Thank you.
All right. I've been asked for a quick break for a minute before we get into our deliberation, I guess you want to call it. So take a break.
I'll just ask that the commissioners not speak amongst themselves because we just had a public hearing.
Okay.
What's the matter? I don't feel well. I'm a little nauseous.
Okay. Just
I'll tell
just tell them. That's fine. Thank you, everybody, for keeping close to the time limit. We're going to continue the public hearing, and we're at the point right now where I'll leave the public hearing open just in case we have other questions of staff or whoever or our speaker. And I do want to remind Commission that this is going to come back to us, so we'll have another opportunity to discuss this. So, but if you have questions or want to give some direction to staff at this point, let's do it now.
I do have additional questions.
Okay, thank you. Lynn?
I actually started putting together sort of a decision tree. I got out my Visio and so I could try and wrap my head around this. And using on page 6 of the staff report, your example, I kind of, as I started reading it, the first question is the unit currently classified as affordable? Yes or no? And as I read what you've got here, if the answer is yes, then they have to replace an affordable. Mm-hmm. If the answer is no, the next question is the unit rent stabilized? And if the answer is no, is yes, the next question is, what is the current income of the tenant? Yes? And so if they're a low-income tenant, the next question is, what is the income? Because it must be affordable, and is it very low, low, or moderate? And then the next question is, if it's not low income, this is where we get to page 8 of the staff report, which in page, okay, so this, it took me a while to figure this out. On page 7 of the staff report, you show the new text. And it includes a paragraph 4, which addresses the conversation that you discuss in page 8. But when I get to the zone text amendment, that paragraph 4 is missing. So on page 12 of 22,
Right. And
paragraph 4 is paragraph 5 back in the staff report.
Right, so I took that out of the proposed ordinance for a reason.
Okay.
It is optional language in the code at the state level, and I think the code you're referring to is that a city with a rent stabilization ordinance can in fact require that the additional units at the property that are not otherwise required to be affordable can either be rent stabilized or affordable units. I pulled that out, but I kept it in your report on page 8. Mm-hmm. It does say that we're still looking at that language, and one of the issues with that paragraph that was in the ordinance is, I believe, for an ownership building, you can't have rent stabilized units in the building. So we need to look at language that either requires additional affordability. If the council wants to adopt this, it's to either require additional affordable units in the building or explore rent stabilized units in rental buildings. What's happening right now at the council, at the next council meeting, we're looking at bringing an ordinance amendment to the RSO that would clarify some language regarding Ellis properties. And I'm mentioning this because it dovetails slightly with this code requirement. Okay. So I'd like to bring that language to the council and receive their feedback, see if they want to act on that amendment. We would then work with that, looking at the housing market here, and bring back an item that addresses this state code at a future date. Because the requirement, if for instance you have an 8-unit project, for the rest of the commission, if you have an 8-unit project, the 1-for-1 replacement requirement in the state law right now is that if you have, for instance, 4 households at that project, at the property, that earn low incomes, you have to replace those units with other units that are at least low. They could be very low as well. It doesn't apply to moderate income households. But the state law also allows a jurisdiction with rent stabilization to adopt a requirement that those remaining 4 units that were otherwise occupied by market rate or moderate income households are either rent stabilized or additional low income housing units to use the bonus. So what we're doing, as I mentioned, so we are bringing a slight change to our RSO, our rent stabilization ordinance forward, that addresses the same replacement requirement for new development, separate and apart from these state laws. It's actually something that was in Ellis and the Ellis Act that we had only adopted recently. We're also looking at the housing market because, as I pointed out, as I showed you in a slide earlier in the presentation, is that we have had we achieve units by using the housing market, and we exact affordability out of the housing market. And we want to make sure that we are not putting a constraint on the housing market that would essentially slow or stop our production of units. So we want to make sure that if we do adopt this language, that we do it in a way that is supportive of our housing market and does not result in a loss or a ultimate reduction of units.
So I get what you're saying, Peter. Thank you about, if these become condos instead of apartments, then what do we do with this law? Which hopefully someone in Sacramento would help us figure out. But as I read this, it says that if it's existing rent stabilized, the city may, or the county may do either of the following: be affordable, make it affordable, or make it rent stabilized. And you're saying that there's actually a third option, do nothing?
Right. It's my understanding that without the jurisdiction taking action to adopt that, it would not be a requirement in our code. And the importance, as I emphasized, of looking at our housing market is that we have to remember that for this to take effect and for our city to achieve affordable housing, the developer needs to use the density bonus. If the developer doesn't use the density bonus, then we cannot prevent the housing from being developed. And so we will lose rent stabilized housing with no net gain in affordability. And right now we have 80% of our projects coming through paying the fee and not providing affordable housing. And we have had that as a current, the past history of our program is that most housing in the city is built without affordable housing. Did you say
8 or 80?
80% of projects in the pipeline are paying the fee. And in the past, or in the past history, as we, that we have in housing, is that we see that that's about the ratio of projects that pay the fee versus provide affordable housing in the city. And so we want to make sure that we don't upset that housing balance, the housing market balance, and that the net effect is that we actually lose projects that would otherwise be providing affordable housing.
I just want to add 2 points onto that. Peter said something that's really important, and one commissioner asked me about this a couple projects ago, so I want to make sure it's clear. These replacement requirements only are triggered if the applicant takes a density bonus. Right. If they pay the fee, there's no replacement requirements. So it's one or the other. Sure. And then the second thing I wanted to mention and just clarify that Peter said at the beginning was in the rent stabilization ordinance, there's a provision that if rent stabilized units are Ellis, taken off the market, another building is built, and they're put back on the market within 5 years, those new units are rent stabilized. So that is one element of complying with this, even if it's not set out in the code yet, because it requires more study on the housing market. So it's happening just in a slightly different way.
And so how does that work? Because we just had this happen in our last meeting. A bunch of stuff got approved as apartments. These didn't happen to include density bonuses, but then later the developer submitted to turn them into condos. Mm-hmm. So if an applicant has gone for a density bonus with the, providing various affordable units and then tries to convert to condos, how does that work?
For replacement or just for how are those units restricted?
How are those units restricted?
There are provisions, Peter could probably speak to this better, but there are provisions in the code for how the affordability restrictions apply to for sale units. There's a long, complicated process in both the state law and our local ordinance that says what you do with them and who they're offered to first. Peter probably has more.
So on a conversion, not just a new build?
So we haven't had a building with affordable units, an affordable apartment building convert to condos. But if that was to happen, we would require, and part of the language that we have in the code requires that they enter into a new agreement that would address the affordability of the units as for sale units rather than rentals.
Okay. And just for my 2 cents, that if we have a choice of affordable and rent stabilization, gee, who are we? We go for the affordable. But I understand Peter's concern about the impacts on the development market, and would we rather have, rent stabilized units or no units? If that's the choice. I mean, that's a tricky, an economic decision. Okay, moving right along.
So maybe as just a point of clarity, I don't want to promise that we can bring this back when we bring the rest of this language back. I think that we'll probably need more time to work on this one particular item.
Okay. My only concern is that we're letting things go, if you will, by not making that a requirement, by not saying you must be either affordable or rent stabilized. It's as developments come through, if that's not in our language, then we've given away that opportunity.
We are working on it. I just wanted to be able to promise what I believe that we can deliver.
Okay. Back to the affordable housing developer that we talked about earlier. You don't have to do this tonight, but could you work on some examples of how that relationship might work? Because I think there's some nuances that we need to flesh out a little bit so that we can make sure our zoning addresses the possible permutations on that. My brain hasn't quite figured out what those might be, but I see some opportunities for some wobbles there that we might want to try to get ahead of. Public outreach, just FYI, your text is about not this issue in your staff report.
Pardon?
On page 22, 21 of your staff report, you discuss your outreach on accessory dwelling units and not the outreach on affordable housing.
Where's the people? Public.
What?
You're asking, where's the public?
We'll correct that when I come back.
Yeah, I mean, you know, what happened at these public outreaches that happened, because I think you said you had 3 of them.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Let me clarify. So for this language, we in fact did bring this language to the Governmental Affairs Committee of the Chamber of Commerce, like this says.
Okay.
And I believe we did bring it on the same date. It's just that we did bring this ordinance at the same time as accessory dwellings units. We did not bring this ordinance out to our housing meetings that we held earlier this year. Those housing meetings are separate meetings, different and distinctive from this. This is a pure code change within our zoning code focused on the development of housing. Our housing programs span we have a much wider breadth than just simply the development of the housing itself, if you will. And so what we did bring out is some of those slides that you saw earlier, which is an update to our housing program, the number of units achieved, but then also looking at our different programs of rent stabilization, the rents within that, our rents within our market, who we're able to target. And I would say a very happy statistic that I like to share is that we haven't lost any displaced households due to the Ellis Act because of our inclusionary housing program. We've been able to successfully offer new housing to anyone displaced in the last 3 years in our program because we've had the units available.
Nice, okay. Page 7 of the resolution. Paragraph 5, where was that discussed in the staff report? I was having a hard time finding it and trying to understand what the implications of this were.
I'm not sure if it's in the staff report, but this is a clarification of how you calculate the base units when you have a mixed-use project, because we don't have a residential density in the commercial zones, which is where the mixed-use projects happened. And I think this is another item that was brought forth to council recently, asking if they want any changes to the code, and I think they wanted to clarify what city does now and not make any changes at the moment. So this was something that I personally get a lot of questions about. I know the planning staff gets a lot of questions about how does this work? How do you calculate the units when you're having a mixed-use project?
FAR.
And so I don't know if it's in the staff report or not, but it's to reflect the current practice and explain to the public how that works.
Okay, I'll take you at your word. I don't feel very explained right now on this one. Last but not least, you changed the word right of first refusal to right of first offer. What was the rationale behind that, and what are the implications? Because I think right of first refusal is a known entity in legal terms, but right of first offer has completely different.
Yeah, thank you. That's actually a good question. And you're right. Right of first refusal has a legal term, and it's very specific. It's used in the Ellis Act, and it does allow for the right of first return if units that are taken off the market using the Ellis Act are returned to the market. Within our inclusionary program, we do offer a right of first option or a right of first availability for new inclusionary units. And the important reason behind that is that the tenants still need to qualify for the units, income-wise. 1. 2, the owners of those new units need to accept them as tenants. And so in that case, it's truly not a right of first refusal. And we had that on our code, and we really need to clarify it because it's important for us as we're working with tenants in the city, in our wait list, we emphasize the fact that you do need to be tenant ready. You do need to be good tenants. You do need to, and we do actually have a nonprofit organization, Alliance for Housing and Healing, that works with our waitlist tenants, with our displaced households, to improve credit scores if need be, to improve their tenant readiness, and so they are able to put their best foot forward and achieve other housing out there in the market. So that's the reason why we're changing that language, is that it's really not, it's not how we can't essentially offer a right of first refusal in the inclusionary program.
Okay,
Okay,
thank you.
thank you. Any other commissioner comments at this time? Okay, yes. You're next. Oh, I'm sorry.
Sherry, are you sure? Okay, thank you. So this is a lot, and thank you, staff, for harboring or fielding all of our questions. There's a specific question I have for you, Peter, and I had emailed you about this earlier, but what I want to understand is what the current need in terms of affordable housing, or inclusionary housing, we'll call it, be it for sale or for rent. What do most people ask for? Like, is it 1 bedrooms? Is it 2 bedrooms? This is like, it's like the foundation of a point that I want to make, but I want to understand more because I actually don't know the number.
Yeah, so, and thank you for asking the question. We look at this in two different ways. So we do know that our average unit household is about 1.5. So we do know
In
that
terms of number of people who reside? Okay.
No, the number of people per household is about 1.5,
Right,
which
okay.
is, it's very low. When
Okay.
you look at LA, you look at our region, and you look in general, even the West Side, the other community that nears us is Santa Monica, but yet we still are. What it means is that we are more single-family households here in West Hollywood than in other communities. So would most people on our wait list be asking for one bedrooms or studios? Yes, because we're one bedroom. We're typically single-person households, especially as we age. Do we need a lot of one bedrooms within our portfolio? We have we have a lot of single person households, so yes. However, we also need to have 2-bedroom units, 3-bedroom units. We do have much less of a need for family units than other areas of LA.
Mm-hmm.
And in truth, we have many less 3-bedroom units in our portfolio than in other areas. We have very few 2-bedroom units. When we look at new projects and the distribution of units within the project and equity within the project, we typically go with an equitable distribution of units within the project. Now,
By equitable distribution, are you referring specifically to the number of bedrooms? I wanted to like define that term.
What we do is we will actually chart out the number of 1-bedroom units, the number of 2-bedroom units, and then the sizes and the size range of those units within the building. And then we take an equitable distribution, meaning that if the building is 80% 1-bedrooms, 20% 2-bedrooms, we look at 80% of 1-bedroom affordable units and 20% of the units being 2-bedroom. And so we're really looking at a good distribution, a good representative distribution of units, not only in terms of spacing them within the building, but also a representative size. Now, developers in West Hollywood are also developing for the West Hollywood market. The West Hollywood market is 1.54 people per household. So developers are building at a rate that's more 1-bedroom units than 2-bedrooms. So what we're achieving in the program is representative of that equitable distribution in the building. And because the builders are building for our market, we're also achieving that distribution that's skewed towards 1-bedroom units.
Okay, I think, Mike, I always try to think about, unintended consequences, and like all of this is, of course, very well-meaning. Of course, I think we all fundamentally understand that. But what I don't want is to not incent developers, and I use the term incent very lightly or vaguely, is to not incent them to build what we need, thereby increasing either rents or increasing the size of the actual units themselves. I mean, Mr. Levin, I think, called this out in his memo, and as a person who had 2 grandparents in a state that is much more affordable than California, who had to be in either assisted living or a nursing home facility, I mean, I would love to meet anybody who is in an inclusionary housing unit or affordable housing who has a 24-hour live-in caregiver, because the cost is astronomically expensive. It's enough to bankrupt somebody, literally, even on their life savings, which was the instance with my family. So, again, I understand that it's well-meaning and that we want to have a variety of housing stock, but I'm trying to get ahead of what might end up being kind of the unintended consequences of getting rid of that minimum unit size. Understanding that it could be smaller, but I worry a little bit about that. And I'm open to discussion on it, but it's just something I want to surface. I know this is in its kind of more nebulous state at this point, but, we have a lot of regulation, and I want to make sure that it has the best possible outcome. So that's what I wanted to say about that. I'm looking over my notes as well. Thank you for your patience. Lauren, we didn't get to talk before the meeting about comportment with state law and the requirement of this narrative, or on whom the burden of proof falls when it comes to showing that or requesting that an applicant write a narrative, not show construction financials when it comes to demonstrating that a concession is fair or grantable, I suppose. Can you... Necessary, thank you. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I can. Taking it back just a little bit, the provision comes in the application requirements. So the new state law, or newish state law, says that the city has to put forth everything they want in the application at the very beginning so that developers come to the city and tell the city what they want to do and what their project's going to look like and what they're asking for. So what is in here is a whole package of application requirements. And so I just want to say this kind of in the big picture first. Tell us how many units you're providing, how many are affordable. So that tells us what size bonus you want. It tells us how many concessions you're eligible for. We have a list of concessions, a menu in the code, and if you're looking for something else, tell us that it meets the requirements of state law. State law says you can deviate from the code, so I can't even get you the language, you can deviate from a code standard through a concession in order to provide for affordable housing costs or affordable rents, to sort of pay the developer back for providing these affordable units in the project. And so concessions aren't anything. Concessions are, it's in the definition, a reduction in development standards, or modification of zoning code requirements that result in identifiable and actual cost reductions to provide for affordable housing costs or rents for the targeted units. So I hear, and Mr. Levin and I can have a very cordial debate over this. We've talked about it. I understand the concern that asking for the information might be used in the wrong way, but the purpose it's being requested for is because you're asking for something different. It's not on the list of what we normally see, so tell us that it meets the definition of what you get a concession for under state law. And I know that there are some cities that require, financial documentation that, that this is a true cost reduction, and that's not what we're looking for here, and that's why we included language to say it can be in narrative form. And so I want to give you an example. I was actually talking with a developer's lawyer a couple weeks ago, and he said something to me that just really kind of rang the light bulb for me. He was saying that for this project that's going to come forward, they're going to ask for one story, which is something that we see all the time. And then in addition to that, they're going to ask for another 3 feet of height. And here is why. Because they need to use concrete instead of steel. And concrete is bigger than steel, so concrete takes up more space, and they need the other 3 feet. And I thought, that's it. That's the type of conversation we want to have. If you want to have this other 3 feet, just explain that concrete is less expensive than steel, and so we're going to use it. It's that kind of conversation. It's not, it's, in the application, at the beginning, tell us what you're going to do, and if it's something different, just explain why. It's not for purposes of denying.
I get it. I totally get what you're saying. I guess because jogging back to the original menu, conversation, which I think we had sometime at the end of last year, when we talked about density requirements or density bonuses, what have you, R2 through R4, that there would be, that we wanted to potentially move, I believe it was height, kind of off menu, to thereby discourage developers from taking that. But I'm wondering, legally, can we treat concessions that are on or off menu differently? I mean, a concession is a concession, right?
But all we're asked is tell us why you meet the definition of concession. That's what we're saying. We're saying, for purposes of this text amendment, we're saying, if you want something that's not listed, just tell us that it meets the definition of concession.
Okay.
And the state law says you can do that. The state law said you can require not studies, not these big things explaining why you're doing this whole project, but you can ask for something that's reasonable documentation to explain that you meet the definition of concession. So, you're not going to ask for architectural projections that go all the way out to the public right away just because it looks great. This has to be something that, is reducing your cost to pay you back. That's where it's coming from, and I think in the application section is a appropriate place for it to go. It's not, the findings for denying concessions are in state law. They are what they are, and this isn't about burden shifting. This is just tell us what you want to do, the whole package, and so the staff can process that and understand.
Okay.
You want that request to be at the beginning of the process,
That's
so that
a
we
big
have
part
a
of this.
complete picture, not
Yes.
after you've gotten approvals and they come back and say, well, we have to do it this way.
And frankly, we get some applicants who come in with a set of affordable units, and then they have one concession, and then they say they need a waiver, and then they ask for a different concession. Well, how can we analyze the waiver if they ask for a different concession after the fact? And it can be very challenging to process. And so telling us what you want to do at the beginning will really help move this along, and we can have open conversations through the process to move these projects along.
Isn't it possible, though, that as they go through the process and they do their drawings and they look at their materials and what they're going to do, that they learn things and that they have to come back? And it would seem like there's got to be some possibility for them to do that.
Yes.
If
That
something
is
happens that changes their project.
Yeah, they can amend their application. It does happen all the time, but it is helpful, and it will help everybody involved if they can make their best effort to know at the beginning.
To think through what all the possible consequences
so
are going to be.
Yes, and just
So
size
it's not-
project they want.
Maybe having the intent written into either the staff report or like maybe having the intent written in would be helpful, just for purposes of clarification. I know I'm like really splitting hairs here, but I think it is merits discussion, just for the purposes of, I think a lot of times I struggle with like, well, what's the intent of this? What was the original point, So those are
Why
my
are we
comments.
doing this?
Right.
Okay. Are you, you're good? Okay, Rogerio, thank you for your patience.
I have two questions, one's for Ed and one's for staff. Ed, in regards to the 650 square foot minimum that you requested, how do we deal with micro units as they come on the market and they have multi-unit housing where the average is maybe 400 feet, and then we have this requirement for 650 for the low income?
Excellent question. I think if you look at how the ordinance is written, it says equivalent size or an option of 650 one bedroom. If you're doing a project where you're averaging 500 square feet, you'll go for the equivalent.
Okay.
The 650 was always an option. Now, it was an option that most people exercised because most people, certainly back in 2007, were not doing smaller units than that on the average. But if you simply leave it the way it is now, it says equivalent size or 650.
So it's a safety net to some degree.
That's right.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you.
And the other question is inspired by this conversation, but not necessarily related, but it's something that is important to me and relates to my question about clustering. I'm not a big fan of clustering low income. I believe that they should be dispersed throughout the building. Clustering could lead to a separate entrance, and I'm happy to hear that we don't have that. I don't know of any code-specific regulation that excludes a separate exit. Is it worth having that conversation in this dialogue that we're having?
The allowance of clustering is purely discretionary by the body, and so any project that had that would come before, for instance, the Planning Commission. I believe that, in fact, I can check that code and we'll return with a little bit of discussion on that, if you like, but it is purely discretionary.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Commissioner Bass, did you have a question? No? And Commissioner Altschuld? Okay. So with that, I guess for tonight, we've exhausted our questions, and I'm sure as we come back, we might get some more. Okay, we're going to continue to a date uncertain because we don't know how much time it's going to take. And are we going to leave the public open? No, we don't have to?
You can close it, because we'll just do another public hearing with another
Okay.
appropriate notice.
So we're going to close the public hearing at this point. And thank you very much, staff, all of you. We do have one more item on our agenda tonight. And that is new business, which is architectural review training. and we have our architect, Mr. Pugh, here to help us out. I think this was something that our commission had asked for, and so we're thankful to have you here to educate us. Yes. Go ahead.
Sorry, I'm not feeling very well, so I think I'm going to step out after at this time, if that's okay with the secretary.
Thank you for staying through this one.
Okay. Thank you. Sorry, I'll see you later. I'm sorry, I'll see you later.
Feel better. 43 seconds.
Well, good evening. It's a pleasure to be here, and hopefully this is a way of developing the language of design review. So I think one of the important things is to really be able to have a conversation. Did it get pushed in? There we go. And it's really being able to have a conversation about design and how design affects our communities and what it is that we expect out of design. And I think that, I move this again. And we'll learn not to move it. There we go. So with that, we will start on this and take a look. So one of the things that we're going to go through here is what architecture, how a way of defining architecture, and really looking at the architectural terms, to look at context, and to touch very briefly on sustainability. Obviously, all of these are big subjects in themselves. So architecture, in this case, is really a building with a specific program or use on private or public land that contributes to the fabric of our society and to the community. So what we're going to look at, first of all, is how uses affect the buildings and how buildings respond to the specific needs of their uses. And then we'll take a look at building design and the various ways in which we look at the elements of building design. So we'll start off with the program. So obviously, if it's a station, it's one thing. If it's a library, it's another thing. And that can be reflected in its form, its shape, the nature of the way it looks, the way it reacts to its environment around it. So, for instance, you will get things such as mixed use, and it has a particular expression that you can see reflected, and it becomes obvious. However, sometimes these things can be realized in different kinds of ways. So, how a station works and looks, does it connect? How does it connect to the community around it? How does it look as a consequence of that? Do we always know that this is a station? Does it broadcast the idea of what its uses are? When we start to look at the language of architecture itself, we look at the idea, one of the important ideas is the idea of form and space. So you can see, for instance, in Pershing Square here, how that kind of bell tower has a strong form. But the space between buildings and the space around it is equally important. So there's this negative, positive aspects in terms of the way that we look at the environment that's created through this. So, for instance, the upper image there is really one that wraps a space through there, and it really, and the forms of it really have a very strong presence. The two towers act like a gateway coming into a city. So they're very obviously very strong forms within the landscape and very important shapes. And how these shapes and forms react in our community is a way of discussing what a building's doing, how it's working, and the importance of the forms that it takes. There's also a difference between solid and open. So this is kind of an interesting little museum in Margate in the UK, and parts of it are open at grade level, parts of it are not. The negative, positive aspects, the figure ground that's going on within this is something, is it friendly to a neighborhood? So for instance, one of the things that we tend to look at in the residential neighborhoods is how do they open up to the community around them? How do they interact with it? And that has a lot to do with the nature of how solid and open is worked. And you can see various ways. So with the Getty Museum, for instance, we have a very strong, solid form sitting on something that's quite spindly, which sort of creates a tension about the way that that looks. But how you look into buildings, how they connect to the street, almost using openness as the ways that the eyes look into the space. Scale and proportion is tremendously important. So obviously, Geary here was playing with scale in a tongue-in-cheek kind of way, but that definitely has a very big impact on what we've got around us. Frequently, we'll look at things in terms of the scale and proportion to the buildings that may be next to them.